Continue our study here with Matthew chapter 24. And we're going to pick up in verse 16, which is where we left off. So, this whole time we've been building up to an event that Jesus is warning the people about that's about to take place, and that's the destruction of Jerusalem. And as he's warning the folks in verse 16, he continues, he says, "Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains." So let's think about this verse, because a lot of people today try to associate this chapter as all of it pertaining to the end of times, and that these are warnings building up to the final day, the end of the world, when Jesus comes back. And this verse here says a lot for us as he's going through these warnings. He says, "Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains." So we have instructions here when we look at this verse. The instructions are flee into the mountains, being specific to those in Judea, indicating that the coming disaster that he's warning everybody about is going to be local. It's going to be the destruction of Jerusalem, not the global universal event that a lot of people today try to turn this into. This is a local event. This is to Judea, which is where Jerusalem's located, in the land of Judea. He goes on to say, "Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. Woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day." So when you look at verse 16 and you start to establish the fact that this is talking to the people in Judea, that this is more localized, the rest of the warnings here make a whole lot more sense than trying to connect it in with the end of the world, the end of all things. You know, the urgency is pretty clear here when Jesus is speaking, when you look at these verses. Those on the housetop or in the field, they shouldn't delay to return for their belongings. In other words, this is really focusing in on the need for an immediate action for those listening to Jesus as he's laying this out. That these signs that he's telling them about, they're going to happen. Jesus is telling them this is going to happen. He expresses concern for those who are pregnant and nursing, just like we see there in verse 19, recognizing the added difficulty for these people, for these women with child who are still nursing. It's going to be tough on them when this happens. It's going to be a crisis, a chaos. And you don't want it to be in the middle of the winter. You don't want to have to be pregnant with a nursing child when this happens as you're trying to get away. And the mention of winter and the Sabbath day pretty much highlights the practical obstacles. Jesus realizes the real things that these folks were going to have to overcome when this takes place. And he's trying to get them prepared. Winter was going to make it tough. The Sabbath day, the gates are closed. You know, what a hindrance that's going to be with the gates being closed on the Sabbath day when all this takes place and then the people are trying to get out of the city. That's going to make it even harder for the people to get out and flee. So Jesus is fully aware of real-world challenges for his followers, and he's trying to get them prepared. It's going to happen. It's coming. He talks about these problems. The gates of the city would be closed on the Sabbath. They would not be able to escape. And you do not want it to fall during that time. So, he's pretty much allowing the people to prepare and be ready to escape this destruction that he's trying to tell them about, the destruction of Jerusalem that's going to take place in AD 70. Not the end of the world, not the end of times, not the coming back of Christ, not the resurrection day, not the judgment day of the world. This is not what this is talking about. But this is talking about a localized judgment on the people in Jerusalem, in the land of Judea, because of their spiritual failures in wanting to obey what God wanted them to do. So, moving on, in verse 21, it says, "For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world, this time, no, nor ever shall be." So this verse that people use today, trying to describe the end of times, the great tribulation that we're looking at here, to keep it in context, is where the Jewish nation is going to fall. The Jewish state. The judgment on Jerusalem is going to take place. The great tribulation that we look at here was an unparalleled time of suffering for the Jewish people, marking the end of their nation as they knew it. Jesus assures that for the sake of the elect, the faithful followers is who we're talking about there, those days would be shortened, preventing total destruction. He says in verse 22, "And except those days should be shortened." If these days were not shortened, there would be no flesh to be saved. For the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. So there's a lot of history that I would encourage everyone to go back and read, because it's very interesting history to look at when we're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And I have a very brief snippet that H. Leo Bowles took on some history research. So history records that Titus, we've talked about him in the last class, Titus determined to reduce Jerusalem by famine, a long destructive mode of conquest, and for this purpose he surrounded it with a wall and a ditch. After completing his preparation for his attack on the city, he received news from Rome, which urged him to hasten to Rome. He changed his plan and pressed the city by assault that he might return to Rome, where his presence was greatly needed. Hence, those days had been shortened. The overruling providence of God shortened these days for the elect's sake. The elect has reference to the Christians who were among the Jews at that time. This elect group were to be preserved in order that the gospel might be handed down for future ages. So, a lot of history here, a lot of interesting tactics that were used by Titus and the Romans as they came upon Jerusalem. You know, he warns that during this period, many will claim to be the Christ, is what it says here. Many will claim to be the Christ. In verse 24, there shall arise false Christs, false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. So he repeatedly cautions everyone about these false Christs, because it was going to be such a tribulation, such a chaos and a disaster and a crisis that people were going to be confused. They were going to look at this And they were going to start to think that maybe this is the end of times. Maybe that person or individual over there claiming to be Christ coming back, maybe that's the case. Christ is saying, don't believe any of that mess. This is not the time for Him to come back. Don't allow this crisis to make you think that this is the ultimate end of all things, because that's not the case. He knew the devastation of Jerusalem would be so severe that some were going to confess that it was His final personal return. And He's telling the people, not the case. This is not that second coming. This is not it. This is a judgment being put on Jerusalem. And the Romans are going to be used to do that. So, Jesus is laying it out. He's taking in the practical things of their daily lives, and He's saying, look, it's going to be hard. For you women with child, look, it's going to be tough. If this happens in the wintertime, it's going to be really hard. If it's on the Sabbath, it's going to be tough to escape the city. So beware, because it's coming, and I'm giving you the signs. He goes on to say in verse 27, so let's look at this. So in verse 24, He's already telling them, there's going to arise false Christs and prophets. They're going to show great signs and wonders. They're going to wow you. And they're going to say things that's going to really get you to think that this is really the end. Insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect, the Christians. So be careful of this. This is going to happen. They're going to come at you. For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Christ is saying, don't let these false teachers and prophets trick you into thinking that my final personal coming is taking place during this judgment. Because lightning is instant and can be seen clearly, and that's exactly what my second coming is going to be like. You're going to know it. Jesus is cautioning His followers not to be deceived. This is not going to be the final judgment of the world. The metaphor, so when we look at this, let's look at verse 27 here. So He uses, for as the lightning cometh. The lightning out of the east shineth even in the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Lightning illustrates that the coming of the Son of Man will be sudden, just like lightning is. It's sudden, it's unmistakable, it's visible to all, unlike the destruction of Jerusalem, which is a localized event. Localized. Christ's return will be universal for everyone on this earth to know about. Not local as what's being described and warned about here by Jesus. I've got up here 1 Thessalonians 5, 1 and 2. It says, but the times and the seasons, brethren, ye have no need that I write unto you. For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. That's the day of the Lord, a thief in the night. So I'm using this to reinforce the unpredictability and the surprise of the day of the Lord. Okay, there's not these signs leading up that you can pinpoint that day. No, that's a day that no man knows. No man knows of that day, and we're going to get into that a little later. The day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night, in other words, unexpected. And all of this furthers the idea and the warnings of what Christ has given here. He's telling them, you're going to see this one coming. Okay, you're going to know it's coming. And if you believe what I'm saying, you'll be ready. Okay, this is different than the end of times. He goes on to say in verse 28, "For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together." So let's think about this. Wheresoever the carcass is, the eagles will be gathered together. The carcass of the Jewish nation. So I believe this is called a metaphor. The carcass represents the Jewish nation after its fall, and the eagles symbolize the Roman army. And we're going to get into that a little bit here in a second as to why I would even say that. The eagle was the official emblem of the Roman legions. It was on their shields, making this imagery immediately recognizable to the folks that are being talked to. They knew what the Roman legions had on their shields. They knew what they wanted to identify as. They were the eagles. You know, speaking of eagles in Job 39, starting in verse 27, Job has, "Doth the eagle mount up at thy command, and make her nest on high? She dwelleth and abideth on a rock, upon the crag of a rock, and the strong place. From thence she seeketh the prey, and her eyes behold afar off. Her young ones also suck up blood, and where the slain are, there is she." So, the very reference of this deepens this metaphor of the carcass that's being used here to describe this Jewish nation. Eagles will naturally gather where there's a carcass, just like Job is laying out here. And because the eagles are going to gather where there's a carcass, when you're talking about actual eagles, so will these eagles be drawn to Jerusalem. The Romans would be drawn to Jerusalem during this time of judgment. They were going to go after Jerusalem. The gathering of the eagles is interpreted as a prophecy of the Roman army's siege and destruction in AD 70. So, when we're looking at this, like I said before, we have a metaphor being used. "For wheresoever the carcass is, there will be eagles gathered together." The Romans, being the eagles, are going to be drawn in to Jerusalem, drawn in on the carcass. They were on a mission to get there. And they were going to be used to put judgment on these people for continually having a poor spiritual state and rejecting what God wanted them to do. And now they're going to be punished, just like in past history. We'll touch on that in a little bit. So just an interesting sidetrack of the Roman shields here. So the eagle was the official emblem, as you see here on the screen, of the Roman legions, directly connecting to this metaphor, like I said before, the eagles gathering at the site of judgment. The shield's design would have been instantly recognized by the people. They knew well all about the Romans and the soldiers. And they would have made a connection that the Romans, they got the eagles on their shields. That's what they're trying to relate to. And they're going to come in on us like the eagles do in the wild. We're their prey. We're that carcass. And this is just to further the imagery of what Jesus is saying here in the metaphors that are being used. Verse 29, it goes on to say, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. So we have some language being used here, some imageries of the sun. You see it in the verse. The sun and the moon and the stars being darkened. This is actually pretty common in the Bible and is used often in other places when we look at this that we're going to read in Isaiah 13. But this is used to describe major judgments or downfalls of nations. And it was used in the past rather than as a sign of some end of times, end of the world scenario, because that's not what this is talking about. Would somebody like to turn to Isaiah 13 and read the first 13 verses? Okay.
The word of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz did see. Lift ye up a banner upon the high mountain, exalt the voice unto them, shake the hand, they that may go into the gates of the nobles. I have commanded my sanctified ones, I have also called my mighty ones for mine anger, even them that rejoice in my eyes. The noise of a multitude in the mountains, like as of a great people, a tumultuous noise of the kingdoms of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts mustereth the host of the battle. They come from a far country, from the end of heaven, meeting the Lord and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. Howl ye, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It shall come as a destruction from the Almighty. Therefore shall all hands be faint, and every man's heart shall melt. And they shall be afraid. Pains and sorrows shall take hold of them. They shall be in pain as a woman that travaileth. They shall be amazed one at another. Their faces shall be as flames. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, full both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate. And he shall destroy the sinners thereof out of it. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. And I will punish the world for their evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. And I will cause the arrogance of the proud to cease, and I will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. I will make a man more precious than fine gold, even a man than the gold wedge of Ophir. Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth shall remove out of her place, and in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger.
Okay, so here we are, well back before this time in AD 70 that Jesus is telling the people about. We now have a judgment that's going to be put on Babylon. Verse 10 says, "For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine." Verse 13 says, "Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth shall remove out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts and in the day of his fierce anger." Judgment language that has been used way back when Babylon was being judged, and is also now being used again by Christ as he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So when we look at this, and we look at this kind of language, you know, these cosmic signs, darkened sun, when we look at this, the moon, falling stars, shaking heavens, you know, they're all used to describe the downfall and the judgment of a nation. This is not literal astronomy that's being discussed, but this is symbolic, basically painting a picture of the total collapse of power and the terror behind God's judgment, of why you should fear God. When you don't listen to him, you should be fearful as to what may happen, because God does not like you to reject him and his word, and especially his Son and what his Son came to this earth to do. Would someone want to read Joel chapter 2, verses 1 through 11? We'll look at that one too.
ye the trumpet in Zion, and sound an alarm in the holy mountains. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord cometh, for it is nigh at hand. A day of darkness and of gloominess, a day of clouds and of thick darkness. As the mornings spread upon the mountains, a great people and a strong, there hath not been ever like, neither shall any more after it, even to the years of many generations. A fire devoureth before them, and behind them a flame burneth. The land is as the Garden of Eden before them, and behind them a desolate wilderness, yea, and nothing shall escape them. The appearance of them is as the appearance of horses, and as horsemen, so shall they run. Like the noise of chariots on the tops of mountains shall they leap, like the noise of a flame of fire that devoureth the stubble, as a strong people set in a battle array. Before their face the people shall be much pained, and all faces shall gather blackness. They shall run like mighty men, they shall climb the wall like men of war, and they shall march every one on his ways, and they shall not break their ranks. Neither shall one thrust another, they shall walk every one in his path. And when they fall upon the sword, they shall not be wounded. They shall run to and fro in the city, and shall run upon the wall. They shall climb up upon the houses. They shall enter in at the windows like a thief. And the earth shall quake before them. The heavens shall tremble, and the sun and the moon shall be dark, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. The Lord shall utter his voice before his army, for his camp is very great. For he is strong and executeth his word. For the day of the Lord is a great and very terrible, and who can abide it?
All right. So we have the context being set here in verse 1. Blow ye the trumpet in Zion, and sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord cometh. For it is nigh at hand, the day of the Lord. A judgment getting ready to take place. The people were being disobedient. In verse 10 it says, the earth shall quake before them, the heavens shall tremble, the sun and the moon shall be dark, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. Judgment language similar to what we just looked at in Isaiah, similar to what we're looking at in Matthew chapter 24. It's to paint a great picture of wrath that's going to come down on those who are disobedient. God's not going to turn his head to those who are sin and reject him and his Son. He's not going to do it. Matter of fact, we didn't read this far, but in the same chapter, Joel chapter 2, verse 31, it goes into saying, the sun shall be turned into darkness, the moon into blood, before the great and terrible day of the Lord come. Okay? A judgment on the people in Israel. Not the end of the world, but a judgment. Because people today, they look at Matthew 24 and they read this and they're going to say, come on guys, how can you not think that this is something end of times that's going to happen? It says the sun be darkened. The moon shall not give her light. The stars are going to fall from heaven. The powers of heaven shall be shaken. But if you're not a Bible student and understand the symbolism and the language of judgment, I can see where you're going to be confused. But this kind of language is used throughout the Bible. And many other judgments of the sun being darkened, the moon turned into blood, judgment language. So Matthew 24, 29 through 31 speaks of Jerusalem in the same way Isaiah 13 spoke of Babylon. Figurative, prophetic language for the fall of a nation. And here we are talking about the fall of the Jewish nation. Going on in verse 29, 30, and 31, it says, again, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, the stars shall fall from heaven, The powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then he goes on now and he says, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with the great sound of a trumpet. They shall gather together his elect from the four winds and one end of heaven to the other. So let's look at this. Then shall appear the sign, is what verse 30 says. Then shall appear the sign, not the actual Son of Man himself. You won't need a sign, just as he said a little bit earlier. You won't need a sign of the Son of Man because he's going to appear in person. You're going to know it when he's there. You don't have signs leading up to it. It's going to be instant, in person, visible for all to see. No signs, because it's going to come as a thief in the night. When the Jewish nation fell, Jesus saying that it's a sign that I'm right where I told you I was going to be. He was coming in judgment by the use of the Roman army. Jesus laid all this out. As a matter of fact, this is part of that statement that he made, that this is the gospel truth, that what he says is going to happen. It's all factual. And he's going to use this Roman army to put judgment on these people. And that's exactly what took place. According to history, it took place dealing with the fall of the Jewish nation. Not a single faithful Christian was destroyed when the nation fell. How is all this possible? Because Jesus gave them signs. Those who heard about the signs, believed the signs, took it serious, they escaped. Those that had doubt, hey, that was their decision and that's on them. They didn't get to escape. So they escaped by taking the sign serious. So the sign of the Son of Man is interpreted as a historical, valid point of Jesus' authority and his prophecy that he's telling them this is going to happen. This is all about the judgment of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, not the personal return of Christ. Because just like we read in Thessalonians, that's going to come as a thief in the night. You're not going to know when that happens. Nobody's going to know. The destruction of Jerusalem is seen as an act of a divine judgment, with Jesus coming in judgment through the agency of the Roman army, rather than a literal physical return, rather than turning this whole event into end of the world. Jesus came back. The resurrection's taking place. No, that's not what's happening here. This is a judgment. The ability of Christians to avoid destruction is linked to basically their belief and their faith that Jesus' warnings were true, and they took it serious, and they escaped. And they were able to get out of this. They took the signs serious. And he says in verse 32, now learn a parable of the fig tree, which his branch is yet tender, and put forth leaves. Ye know that summer is nigh. My phone is thinking I'm talking to it. Sorry about that. So, the parable of the fig tree. Jesus uses a fig tree to help the disciples understand what he's been teaching about here. So let's think about the fig tree. So a fig tree was a native product of Palestine in a very warm climate. The fruit makes up a very large portion of their customary food. So they They knew all about fig trees, okay? They understood fig trees. So fig trees in Palestine, the fig tree is one of the first trees to sprout leaves in the spring, signaling that summer was near, okay? It was a sign that summer is near. The seasonal cycle is predictable and easily observed. And here Jesus is saying, okay, let's look at this, guys. Now learn the parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender, putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. It's giving you a sign. Summer was upon us. The fig tree is now growing leaves. Just as the appearance of the leaves on the fig tree is a reliable indicator that the coming season is getting ready to happen, summer's coming. Well, the signs Jesus described of the wars and the tribulation and false prophets, all that are also reliable indicators that the destruction of Jerusalem is coming and it's going to happen. So for these people, as much faith as they have in these leaves telling them summer's on the way, Jesus is saying in verse 33, so likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Oh, it's for sure. It's not going to disappear. As sure as the leaves are indicating the summer is as sure as the signs are going to be for the destruction of Jerusalem. So this parable that Jesus is throwing out here, this fig tree parable, is specifically tied to the destruction of Jerusalem, staying in the context of what he's been talking about in all the previous verses. The signs are for a local historical event and not the final end of the world Jesus' second coming event like a lot of people try to turn it into today. Jesus is saying, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. It was coming soon. And some of them, and most of them, were still going to be alive to see it. Verse 33 and 34 says, so likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. So let's think about that. The signs we just studied were to identify the fall of the Jewish nation. The end of the Jewish state was not the final end world judgment that was to take place. This is a localized. Signs described in preceding verses, again, wars, tribulation, false prophets, were meant to help the followers of Jesus know that it's coming and get out of it so that they didn't have to deal with the hardships of war and death and loss of their loved ones, but they could escape. They could take it serious. It says in verse 34, verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. This generation, Jesus emphasizes, the people living at that time will not pass. Strong argument when we look at this verse, a strong argument that the signs and events described up to this point are specifically geared towards the destruction of Jerusalem and not the end of the world final judgment of everyone. Strong point. This generation says localized. Remember how we started the lesson. It was a message to the people in Judea. Okay, Judea, flee to the mountains, you people in Judea, localized. The Bible is not complicated if you slow down and read the context of what's being discussed. There are not any signs in connection with the final judgment. Jesus says, but of that day and hour knoweth no man. So there's not going to be signs for that. Matthew 24:3, let's remember how we started this. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world? Tell us, when shall these things be? Jesus described the signs in verse 4 through 34 that we just went through. He's answering their questions. These signs for the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And then they said, and what shall be the sign of thy coming? Jesus describes that his coming would be in judgment on the Jewish nation, in connection with his statement about destroying the temple. He's answering their questions. The question is for them is, are they going to listen? History records this judgment came through the Roman army. And this was not a personal coming of Christ, but instead was another judgment being made on a wicked nation. Just like we saw in Isaiah and just like we saw in Joel. Judgmental language is taking place here. So as we come to an end of this, I do want us to get a bigger picture as to why this would have been such a heavy statement to be made that the temple's going to be destroyed. Okay, the temple's going to be destroyed. We have to understand that the temple is pretty massive. This is a pretty big feat. The Temple Mount in the first century. This is a computer-generated picture of it. This makes it a little more real for you. But for statements to be made, we're going to destroy the temple, yeah, questions are coming up saying, how is that going to even happen? That's a pretty major feat to say you're going to destroy the temple. And it was a pretty major judgment on Jerusalem and a pretty major war of the Romans coming in and taking over and destroying them. A major pivotal point in history of a judgment happening on a nation. So, I don't want to go any further in Matthew 24 today because we're about to switch gears. And as of right now, we've been discussing this destruction of Jerusalem up to this point. So, any questions or comments before we end class? All right. Thank you all.